At Leadership Vision, we help leaders and teams achieve their goals through time-tested leadership wisdom and practical application. We do this through consulting, team development, coaching, custom content creation, and more. But sometimes, many times, our clients remind us about these leadership lessons in unexpected ways. In the summer of 2022, Brian and Linda Schubring, our president and vice president here at Leadership Vision, had the opportunity to work with 70 leaders at an international school in Europe. Over the course of 7 workdays, they learned so much from the educators there. Today on the podcast, Brian and Linda will be sharing 3 unexpected things that they learned from these leaders. They're going to be talking about why the mission of an organization needs to be communicated early and often, how strengths is not the end goal, but merely a tool, and how taking risks might be the thing that you're missing in your organization. So keep listening. You are listening to the Leadership Vision podcast, sharing our expertise in the discovery, practice, and implementation of a strengths-based approach to people, teams, and culture. For more resources about developing your strengths, the strengths of your team, or the strengths of your entire organization, click the link in the show notes or visit us on the web at leadershipvisionconsulting.com. Hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Freeberg, and let's just jump right into this conversation. Here is Dr. Linda and Brian Schubring and myself chatting about the 3 things that they learned from a group of international leaders. Brian and Linda, you were recently traveling. You've been traveling a lot in the last couple months here.
We've been traveling more in the last few months than we have in the last 2 years. So.
Yeah. And you were working with a group of 70 leaders, international leaders, and we have some takeaways that we're going to talk about here, these kind of big lessons. But before we do that, do you want to, Linda, just tell us a little bit more about this experience, kind of generally, and then we'll get to the specific takeaways?
We began thinking about what is it that we have been learning. And so every once in a while, it's important to zoom in on one specific thing and gather some takeaways or gather some specific, maybe unexpected things that we have learned so that we can, add to our practice, add to our repertoire, and continually improve. And the zooming in on this particular week-long experience came from last week. And last week we had strengths communicator training. And one of the strengths communicators is actually a very avid listener to the podcast. So hello, you know who you are. And the way that the cohort worked, I volunteered to be a participant in a strengths conversation. So he was the host and I was the participant, and he started asking a variety of questions, and he was practicing becoming a really good strengths communicator. He's very talented. And he said, Linda, describe a time when you were happy. And, I took pause and I said, well, it was when we were working at an international school to kick off their school year. And the host, the strengths communicator, said, what about the time that you had stirred such happiness? And in my mind, Nathan, I just said everything. I loved being back in Europe. I enjoyed meeting some of the most incredible leaders and genuinely great humans. We were in person. That was lovely. And the joy and intensity were magnified. We were thrilled to be working with a leader who has always asked us to reapply or convince him again that we are the people to do the work. And Brian and I like that challenge, and it's a pleasure to work with him and for him. Personally, I love seeing the sun come up over the city on my morning run. I love the coffee, pastries, the drive to school, the partnering with Brian, the things that I was learning. I love that feeling of being a good tired. There's stupid tired, and then there's a good tired. And as Brian was saying at the beginning of this podcast, I really love delivering with excellence and being pushed every single day. And so our time in the school, over 70 hours in 1 week's time, gave us some unexpected learnings, and it stirred happiness in me, but there were specific things that we want to talk about today that were unexpected, that can be applied to many different situations. But as we do the practice of zooming in and zooming out, this is one of the zooming in moments that we want to speak about.
As I'm listening to you share that, what was catching my attention is that, yes, we were in Europe. Yes, we were with someone familiar, but how it is that we respond to place.
Yeah.
And the people in that place. So I think that the application is, like you started with Nathan, how much we've been traveling. We've been reminded after 2 years doing everything on Zoom, how much we respond to the place that we're in, whatever that environment is, and how the people show up in that place. All of the indicators, all of the little tips and tricks that we used to use all the time, we were reminded of that. And it just brought a whole new life. And many people are saying some of those same things, but this experience was perhaps one of our first and earliest reminders of what it's like to be somewhere in person with people.
The 3 things, I'm going to read them here, high level, and then we're going to dive into each one of them a little bit deeper. Number 1 is about communication. Number 2 is about strengths as a tool. And number 3 is about risk. So the first one, the number 1, I guess in no particular order, unexpected thing that you learned from these leaders was about communication. Repeat the objective and purpose over and over again. Tell me about this.
Yeah, well, I'll kick it off because the school head that we worked with is a gifted, seasoned, powerful communicator. And at least 4 of the gatherings that we were part of just in 1 week, he introduced the year and he reminded everyone what the focus was, what they were doing at the school, what it meant for them to lead, set some of the goals out in front of them. And if I were to summarize it, and I don't know what you would say, Bren, but if I were to summarize it, it was team, 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 team.
That is the summary. It is a word that was repeated over and over again. And even though this individual was a masterful communicator, he is a masterful communicator. What I really appreciated, one of the extraordinary takeaways for me was repetition of the simplicity of a primal message. And that primal message was, we belong together as a team. And that we belong together is not just the invitation to belonging, but the intentionality of we belong together. You've been brought here. You've been chosen. You've been hired. You've been placed on a team. And that message was emphasized over and over and over again. I don't know about you, Linda or Nathan, but sometimes I like to think of all these new ways to say the same thing. Creative words, new adverbs, new adjectives, 3 words that start with letter T or whatever it is. But that wasn't what we experienced. I experienced the simplicity of the repetition of an important message. And I got to watch as people were drawn into that attention getting through communication. And I have to say, I've been practicing that ever since, like just not being afraid to say things over and over again, because we know it's through repetition that people will receive, especially a message that's important.
As we think about communication, it's communicating regularly and often. When we think about communication, it's also directly and repeatedly. The more that we heard this message, I felt like I'm not even staying at the school for the year, but I almost had it internalized in me. And that's where some of the fine tuning, as well as the, how we could share about even what we learned. So the communication, that is one of the unexpected things we've learned.
I've heard someone say, vision leaks. And so the more that you can do that, it's so helpful. The second thing that you learned, and we all know this, but strengths is a tool. Strengths is not the goal. Is that blasphemy? Explain yourselves.
No, that was a huge aha for me. There was a guy that was a part of the entire process, and he was someone that I was really drawn to by the way he was thinking, how he showed up, how he held himself. And his thinking was so counterintuitive to mine, and I'm just naturally gravitating towards that. And I could tell he was wrestling with our approach. He was wrestling with the language. And I spent a lot of time talking to him through the time that we were there. And something he said really unlocked an understanding and an applicability for me. We do use the Clifton Strengths as our psychometric of choice in the work that we do. And sometimes that's a hurdle for people. And This guy's awareness was this. He's like, oh, I get it now. He said, what I'm learning is you are using strengths as a tool, and strengths is not the goal. And this guy was saying, I had this idea that when strengths were introduced, like strengths is going to be the goal, whereas he meant that strength was going to be the answer to all of our problems when it comes to conflict or communication, that there's a strengths answer. And he said, your approach isn't that. Your approach is simply strengths is a tool, and there are a lot of tools, processes, and systems that can help us get to where we're going, but strengths is not an answer. Strengths is not a belief system. Strengths is not the end towards which we're all going. It's just one of the tools. And that really permeated the thinking of the group too, because we were able to really stand on what he was saying and reinforce that as really our approach. And I've used that over and over and over again ever since. I am really grateful for his wisdom on that one.
Me too, because then we weren't a strengths people pushing a tool.
Which one? Yeah.
We were partnering, and we used his vernacular that he knew because he was living in the culture, so that it gave us some great insight.
And we added further refinement to that statement by saying, we often begin with strengths, and that our process is informed by strengths. We don't always carry that strengths language and strengths orientation with us the entire time through. It is a tool that we're using, and that was really important for us. Huge takeaway.
Context is so important to all of that too. So it's, the third one here is take some risks. Did you go bungee jumping while you were there? What was the big risk?
We got on the airplane in the post-COVID world, or current COVID world, or whatever. We took many risks to go, to respond, to be there. The people that we were working with, they were taking risks with each other, with the things that they would share, with the revelation about who they were as people and leaders and professionals. We even had some leaders kind of risk the fact that they didn't see themselves as a leader prior, but they were stepping into a greater sense of, oh yeah, I am a leader. I am a person of influence.
One of the big risks I remember is as we were leaning into not only the high expectations, but the changing expectations that were happening over time. Linda and I also had the opportunity to create new strategies for how we were going to engage the teams while we were there. Now, I love that creative process, but when that risk needs to happen in a couple of hours prior to you meeting with the team, that's a whole different level of risk that I'm not that comfortable with. But we also know this. We also know that Linda and I have the capability to do it. And we also know that we don't have to do all the work ourselves, that when you allow the participants to do the work with you, then you share the responsibility of the risk that you're taking. Because sometimes all we need to do is invite people into the risk with us. That dissipates the level of the risk, but then we all share in something unique, because that's when breakthroughs really happen, is when we have that confidence of, you know what, my confidence says I can take the risk, and you don't know what the result is going to be, but something happens and the group responds and you're moving into new territory. When that happened, I was surprised. And there are these moments that we're looking at each other like, oh yeah, this is actually happening right now. And they're responding. But then again, and as we all know, we had to rely not just on our instinct, but our intuition on how it is that we navigate these people with the process and the topics that we were talking about. And that we have a lot of experience with.
There were times where we had to risk staying the course. Like sometimes that's risky. You think like, is this going to land somewhere? And then there were times, as Brian was mentioning, where we had to risk just stepping into some new and creative places. But one of the things that we practice is trust emergence. One of the things that Brian and I actively do is step into an unknown situation. We don't know exactly all the questions. Everything is not perfectly scripted. And we have to trust that the wisdom will emerge, the insight and the specific advice or feedback or sentiment will be shared. And it feels very risky, but with big risk comes big reward.
Well, and I find that, especially in this realm, that the reward is often significantly greater like the upside is there's a bigger upside than there is a downside.
Yep.
And so sometimes people get so afraid of taking these risks with human potential, with pushing boundaries of, team building, that they're like, oh, it might, it's not that, like the worst case scenario is not that bad, but the best case scenario is so great that it's very often worth the risk. So thank you, Brian, Linda. This is fun. So to summarize, communication is important. Repeat the objective and purpose over and over and over and over and over and over again. Is that enough? Okay. Strengths and over again. Strengths is a tool, not the goal. So I think that's so important, because you have to remember that we're in the business of pushing people forward, not pushing a tool onto people. And take some risks. Know your context. Know what it is that you're there to do, and be a little risky, because the upside is much greater.
A huge shout out to the wonderful people that we worked with.
Brian, Linda, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks, Nathan.
And thank you for listening to the Leadership Vision podcast, sharing our expertise in the discovery, practice, and implementation of a strengths-based approach to people, teams, and culture. For more resources about developing your strengths, the strengths of your team, or the strengths of your entire organization, click the link in the show notes or visit us on the web at leadershipvisionconsulting.com. I'm Nathan Freeberg.
I'm Linda Schubring.
I'm Brian Schubring.
And on behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening.
I'm out.
Stop.